Hi team, I'm coming to you today to go through the first of our educational series on training peaks, designed to help you understand a little bit more about the behind the scenes of training peaks and how to review your training, look at data, what it does actually mean, and then going into a little bit of detail of what I look at as a coach as well. So hopefully you'll find this beneficial. Where I'm starting today is where most of you will spend the majority of your time in Training Peaks, which is the calendar. So you can see there you've got home, calendar, dashboard, and ATP or annual training plan. So today we're going over the calendar and some of the ins and outs of that. So this is what you would see mostly. So your training sessions that are completed and or planned, laid out there in your week. And then at the end of the week, you'll see a summary. So a summary of what's been completed or currently being completed for the week. Now, this athlete is me, so I don't mind you seeing and looking at my data. So what we're looking at here is the summary. You can see at the start there, or the top there, fitness, fatigue, form. Now, I'm not going to touch on those numbers and what they mean today because I'm going to go through that in our next educational series. So we'll leave those there for today, but the summary here that you can see is just gives you an outline for your total durations or total distances for your week from a Monday to Friday. Now, a couple of things here. Some athletes don't actually work on a Monday to Friday basis, so those numbers really can be irrelevant. So I have some athletes that are shift workers or work on an 8-day or 10-day roster or cycle. So, working a summary over a 7-day period can be irrelevant. I also find that these numbers can be irrelevant as well. So you can see here I've done for the total bike of 196 kilometers, run 47 and a half, etc. Now for me, those numbers also can be irrelevant, okay? Other than saying, okay, that's the total distance that I've completed. But what I look at as a coach is what actually was completed in there. So we're not just training for training's sake and ticking off kilometres for the sake of ticking off more kilometres than the week before. So keep that in mind that when you see a week and if you've done less kilometres in previous week or a week coming up, doesn't mean that the week was any easier. Okay, so because there could be some more intensity in there. So throughout the year, that will change in regards to the purpose of the time of the program that we're at and where your races are sitting at. What we look at here, though, as a summary is that third number there, TSS. You can see for that week, 781. So TSS is total stress score. So how much stress did my sessions elicit on my body for the duration of that week? So that number to me is more relevant. So that tells me how hard overall my week was. Now, where that number comes from or pulls from is from each of your individual sessions. So you'll notice that an easy session will be the lower number. The harder or longer the session, the number will be higher. So you can see walking there at 12 TSS, which is not much, but still creates a little bit of stress, which is why I still pop them in my program. But you'll see here an hour 45 on the bike, a TSS of 112. So calculating all those out, and that gives us a number of how much stress was for the week. And again, so that stress can come from duration, but also intensity. So a 1 hour run an aerobic run would be a totally different stress to a 1 hour threshold run or a 1 hour race. Okay, so just keeping that in mind as well. So we're trying to create more stress as we go through the year, but then also different stress at different times of the year. So keeping that in mind, I'll go more in regards to how I program and what a year looks like, etc. in a later session. Okay, so then what we do, what a lot of you probably do, is jump into a session and start to analyse or view what happened in your session, how did you go, based on the information that it's spitting out at you. So the first thing I do when I jump into a session, so this is a bike session, is this one you may not be aware of. So you can actually smooth out what the data spits out as. All right, so if you've got it far to the left, you'll see here it's pulling up lots and lots of data, every second probably, or every 3 seconds it's spitting data onto the graph. Now that is hard to review and analyze when it looks that detailed. So what you can do is drag that across and start to smooth it out a little bit. So you can see now my sections are a little bit more smoother, and I can pull data from there a lot easier. So that's something that you can do, is just to smooth that out. So I generally go somewhere in the middle, so I can clearly see now individual sections of this particular session. Now this session here was a hard strength session. So then what I then tend to do is, when I'm looking at the session, is the key components of the session. So here I can see there was 4, maybe 5 hard sections here. So I would actually drag over that particular section, and what that does is brings over here, down here, it creates that section. So a 6-minute effort. What would be easier is if an athlete actually clicked lap at the start and the end of each interval that they've got for a particular session. So if you're doing 6 lots of 6 minutes, lap your watch while you're doing that, so that data automatically comes here, and I can actually see them all lined up and review them individually. Otherwise, from a coaching perspective, I'm actually clicking on those. Sometimes I'll even add them in. So if I'm wanting to keep that. So I can type in, say, interval number 3. So I can type that in and actually add that. So that section I can always come back to and click on very easily. So that's how you can look at individual sections of your training sessions. Hopefully you are all already across that. But what I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here is these numbers on the right hand side. So at the moment this is just looking at the entire workout. So what we have here are a lot of information that you may not even be aware of what they actually mean. So I'm just going to go through that. So work, kilojoules. So basically how much calories were burnt during your session, and that's based on your heart rate and other information that you've got in your Training Peaks account. NP, normalized power. Now you might hear people talk about normalized power. Most people talk about average power. So I'll go through that down a little bit further. But the difference between average and normalized power is normalized power takes into account the metabolic costs if that ride, so we're talking about a ride here, if that ride was actually steady state compared to average power. So a session could have an average power, this session, average power of 145, but there was lots of high-end power work within the session. So Training Peaks created an algorithm to take into account those hard efforts and the metabolic costs that would actually take a toll on your body. Because as you know, as you go through a session, the fatigue starts to kick in a lot more by doing hard intervals over the same duration than if you just rode at an average power of 145 for the same duration. So hopefully that makes sense. So an hour 45 session, even though my average power was 145, my normalized power was 168. All right, so that's how hard the session effectively was for me. And where that can become useful is we use that information when we're planning out race plans. So again, I'll go over that in a bit more details, but that's the difference between average and normalized. PW heart rate. So that's the ratio. So it's power to heart rate. The ratio the ratio of your power to your heart rate from the start to the finish of a session. Now, this isn't used a lot, in particular in a session like this, but you might look at that at an endurance-based ride. So essentially, you want to, if you're doing an endurance-based ride, you don't want too much of a heart rate variation in there. I can go over that in more detail for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more, but it does dive a little bit deeper. So we'll leave that one there for today. Elevation gain and loss, that's pretty explanatory. W per kilo, so watts per kilo, is essentially your watts, so your power, divided by your weight. So again, this is where it comes into play, that making sure you have your information up to date and accurate in Training Peaks or Zwift or whatever other device that you're using in your Garmin. So watts per kilo, and again, that can be used when trying to work out what you want to be working towards from a racing perspective. We then go on to the right-hand side. IF is intensity factor. So how intense the session was relative to your threshold. So if that number was 1, so 1 being your threshold over 1 hour. So if you completed a session for 1 hour at your threshold, that number would be 1. As you can see here, mine for this session was 0.8, so it takes into consideration the duration and the intensity of the session, and that creates an intensity factor. To give an idea, an endurance-based session should be around 0.6 to 0.7, a solid tempo 0.8 to 0.9. So as you can see, that's where mine fits in for this one. This also can be used for calculating race pace calculations. So there's some formulas around if you were doing a half Ironman, what intensity factor you want to be racing at. So again, I'll go through more race information in a later section or later part of this series. What else have we got there? VI, variability index. This one is how variable your power was over the session. So you normalize power to your average power. So as we mentioned before, my normalized power is 168, my average power is 145, and that gets a variable index of 1.16. If you were looking for a steady endurance-based ride, that number, your normalized power and your average power, should be pretty similar, and that number should be close to 1. Okay, so again, if you were looking, you're an endurance-based athlete doing a long-distance event, you want that variable index to be low. So you don't want to be having big spikes in your race, because that cost starts to come and catch up with you later on. So that's variable index. Then we have EF, efficiency factor. VI was 1.16, efficiency factor 1.18. So this one's a difference between normalized power and your average heart rate. So a drop of this number over a similar session over time would indicate an increase in fitness. So this is so similar to when we do a math test. So if you do a math test, your average heart rate you're sitting at for your math is 145, and you're able to run at 6 minutes per kilometre. Over time, if you get that down to 5.5 minutes per kilometre, but you're still sitting at the same heart rate, that means you become more efficient. So we're trying to become more efficient with what we're doing. So that's what that number there is. Then we go down here. So that's just an overview of the session in total. As I said, the average power of the total session, the max numbers. So this, is a good overview, but it doesn't tell a great detail, particularly in a session like this when I had lots of variables within the session. So what I, again, tend to look at is the individual sections rather than the overall session, unless it was supposed to be a steady state or endurance-based ride or run. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of what the information is within your session. You may want to re-listen over this to help you understand that a little bit more if needed. Then the last one I was just going to go through was your threshold zone. So all this data and information is calculated on your threshold zone. So if your zones aren't accurate, well then that data is not going to be accurate. So it's going to be really irrelevant. So this is where your zones come into play. So you'll see there's lots of different ones that can sit here. So swim, bike, run, heart rate, power, etc. So making sure you understand your zones and where they sit is important. So there's no point doing a session and I've written 5 minutes at threshold when you have no idea what your threshold zone is. So understanding that, jump in and review your zones, write them down, stick them on the fridge, whatever you need to do so you can start to remember those. You can also have them, make sure that your Garmin is up to date and accurate as well. And any information like your height, your age, your weight, etc. in your profiles on any of these platforms as well. So whether it's Zwift, Training Peaks, your Garmin in particular, make sure you've got those there. So one I was going to touch on was in regards to FTP. So when we do a 20-minute FTP test, that gives you a threshold for 20 minutes. Now, when someone asks you what's your FTP, it's actually based on your 1 hour FTP. So what you can hold for 1 hour. So what you did for 20 minutes is not actually your functional threshold power. That's your 20-minute threshold power. So to get your 1 hour FTP, you actually times it by 95%. Okay, so that's where the number will come in there and calculate your training zones from that perspective. So that's just one I just wanted to make you aware, because a lot of people think their 20-minute threshold is what their FTP is, but it's actually 95% of that, and that's why you'll often see that number in there is different to what your last FTP test was, and that's why. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of the calendar, how to look at your sessions, or what some of the information means. And I look forward to sharing more with you over the coming weeks as I delve into our Training Peaks educational series. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know.